Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. The year 1968 marked history throughout the world, and Mexico was no exception. The massacre of Tlatelolco changed the course of Mexican history in ways that we probably don't fully understand to date. Today, 50 years later, we're going to be talking about how it transformed not a nation only, but a generation itself. We're very happy to have with us to talk about this important issue, Jesus Vargas. Jesus, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Jesus is a survivor of the massacre of Tlatelolco and a historian from the state of Chihuahua. Jesus, 1968 was a turning point in Mexican history. To start with, can you tell us what you experienced personally that year?
Well, Laura, 1968 was a very important point in the history of Mexico, and also a crucial moment in my life. My life completely changed in 1968. Even my mother said that I was born again that year, because I left behind the person that I had been for the previous 22 years. After 68, my attitude towards life and my conception of life totally changed from what it had been when I was a student.
Where were you when the massacre took place that was really the point of rupture in terms of a before and after in Mexican history?
I was there when the massacre happened. I was on the third floor minutes before the shooting started, and I was able to survive in very difficult conditions. I hid for about 3 hours in an apartment because a woman opened the door for me and protected me. She protected me by letting me stay there until I felt that I could leave. After that, I went back to Chihuahua, where I come from, for a few days, and then I came back to Mexico City to keep participating however I could under the circumstances.
Because we know that after the massacre, they actually hunted down students in some of those surrounding buildings. Did you have to hide in this apartment?
There were many students, and men and women who were not students, who were able to survive. There were many who were able to get out right at the beginning. When the snipers started looking for students in the apartments, they already left. There were many students, and I was one of those who was lucky enough to have left the plaza right away, and so I escaped the siege that the army had put around the plaza. So, actually, the number of people who were arrested was a few hundred out of about 10,000 people who were demonstrating at the protest. This event was very, very dramatic for the history of Mexico. But the students, after October 2nd, those who survived, those who were able to escape, we didn't focus on that date. We returned to our classes, and we returned with the intention of regrouping as a movement.
You were a leader of the student movement at the time, correct?
I was a representative of my school. I studied in the National School of Biological Sciences, part of the National Polytechnic, and during the whole strike I represented my school at the National Strike Council. When we went back to classes in January '69, I returned as a leader in my school. We organized a lot of activities in '69, and it wasn't until August 1970, when we, along with many other students, we decided to leave school to go work with different communities, in peasant communities, with workers in neighborhoods and city slums. We decided to go and work organizing them. So I, along with many other students, made that decision to leave school, to forget about school, and to dedicate our lives to organizing a new revolution. Those are the terms we were thinking back in.
I want to talk about this stage after the repression, where so many students went out and began to do grassroots organizing. But first I wanted to go back and just ask you, were you surprised at this level of open repression? What did that mean to the moment, to the movement?
The dimensions, the extent of the massacre, that was a surprise. We knew that something was being planned, something big. That same day, October 2nd, the National Strike Council had a meeting in the morning. I was there. The meeting was in the Polytechnic and at the Zacatenco campus. On September 26th, we had organized a demonstration that was very similar to the one in October 2nd. And at that demonstration, which also had been like an assembly, we had decided that we could have another demonstration on October 2nd, and that the main action we will take on October 2nd will be to march from Tlatelolco to the Casco de Santo Tomás campus, which is a campus of the Polytechnic that was being occupied by the army. So we were going to go to the Casco de Santo Tomás to demand that the army withdraw. That was what we agreed on. Taking into account all the rumors that we were going around and all the bits of information that were more or less serious, the first thing we agreed to in the morning of October 2nd was actually to suspend the demonstration and not to go. And then we also agreed that at the demonstration only the speakers, those who were going to participate in the demonstration, will be in the Chihuahua building on the 3rd floor. And all of the other members of the National Strike Council, we will be downstairs. We failed to follow through with that plan, and it ended up being fatal, because that afternoon we were right there. Dozens of leaders and representatives who weren't going to participate as speakers. And then, when the Olympia battalion that was in charge of finding and arresting the leaders, well, they came in and they found the most important, most recognizable leaders of the National Strike Council. So yeah, we definitely never imagined that they were going to be shooting into the crowd like that. We never imagined it. We thought they were going to arrest us, they could come for us at our houses. In fact, many of us, including myself, were already being monitored at our houses. But we never imagined that there will be this kind of repression. And it was just that, Laura, what the writer Carlos Montemayor, following the investigations done by Julio Scherer and Carlos Monsiváis, he did a deeper study in a book called Remaking History. And in that book, he shows how the attack against the people at the demonstration was prepared, and how the only person who could have been able to make such a decision was the president.
So it was a decision from the highest echelons of the state. And he has a posthumous book coming out on the same subject, doesn't he? You've been involved in presenting that new book.
It's a book that was published in 2010. The first edition was, it came, and then after he died, there was a new edition, but the new edition didn't make it to the bookstores. The book has practically been out of circulation for 8 years. It's called State Violence in Mexico Before and After '68. What Carlos Montemayor does in this book is to analyze 5 events where campesinos, peasants, workers, and students were repressed. He writes about the events of Aguas Blancas, Acteal, the Alameda in 1952, and Tlatelolco in October 2nd. And the part about October 2nd, we took it from the book because it's hard to find. And we made a pamphlet with the family's permission. We made a book that's 130, 120 pages long, and it has the part where Carlos analyzes the events of October 2nd and also of June 10th, using declassified documents from the United States government and some documents from General Marcelino Garcia Barran. And in that book, we show very clearly how repression was planned and organized that day.
And from that book and that evidence, historic evidence that's gathered there, it becomes clear that this was a concerted effort on the part of the state to quell a movement, a resistance movement. So then later, in the stage after 68, when you go back to the schools, the movement doesn't die, it doesn't run away out of fear, which was probably what the government hoped. You go back to the schools and then begin this stage of grassroots organizing. Was this in part as a form of protection? What was behind that rationale?
Well, Laura, the explanation is very simple. The movement started as a protest against an aggression against students, and within a few weeks the movement had already lost its identity with that act of repression, and it had converted in a movement that took up the causes of people in general. In a few weeks, the movement was transformed into a movement for democracy, a movement for justice, a movement for the most marginalized people in this country. And when we went back to our classrooms, we weren't thinking about the students who faced repression on July 26th. We were thinking about our commitment to the people and that we wanted to fight with the people for democracy. Because we had the conviction that in this country, democracy still hadn't been established, even though one of the slogans of the revolution of 1920 was effective suffrage, no re-election. So we were convinced that as long as elections weren't respected in this country, not only presidential elections, elections for deputies and senators, but also the elections in ejidos or in the labor unions. What I'm saying is that in Mexico, and I still think so 50 years later, as long as democracy isn't respected in Mexico, as long as the people's choices aren't respected, we will be stuck in many problems, and we are not going to be able to fix those problems by keeping the people on the margins of the development of democracy in this country.
So in this moment, democracy moves to the center stage. It's no longer a student movement. The student movement almost instantly becomes broadened to a general national movement for democracy. Was this because authoritarianism showed its face so baldly, and because there was instantly so much more sympathy for the students of themselves? How did these contacts between the student movement and other movements for democracy get made at that moment?
It all came together, Laura, just like you said. On the one hand, we felt very close to the people during the months of the strike, because the people who worked in the markets, the truck drivers, the factory workers, they gave us a huge amount of support. They welcomed us, they expressed their sympathies, and we felt so much real affection. Us, as young people who had never had a political experience, we felt that we were doing something that was really important. So it was a strong dose of awareness given to us by the people themselves. And through the movement, there were many authoritarian acts by the government. And We described those actions that way, but October 2nd, that was something unimaginable. So we connected on September 1st, for example, when the president gave his annual address. I think it was his fourth. The students everywhere in our houses, at our schools, we were paying attention to what he was going to say. And what he said, it was a threat. He told us that if we didn't stop doing what we were doing, he was going to act, using all the resources available to him to stop us. In other words, well, that's what he said. And of course, for us, it was like a bucket of ice water thrown over our heads. Because we were still hoping that the president was going to take a conciliatory tone with us, but that's not what happened. So we were very angry. We had already been hurt by the government's authoritarianism, and many of our comrades had already been killed, murdered. But the unity that we had with the people, the integration, the identity between us and the people, especially in Mexico City, well, it gave us the tools to imagine that our futures didn't depend on graduating from school, from getting a degree, that our future wasn't in the classroom. Well, I'm talking about the most advanced, the vanguard among us. I'm talking about those of us who took all this very seriously. So between the 1969 and 70, we did a lot of activities, demonstrations and assemblies. We passed out pamphlets, flyers. We went to factories, and our entire message was now directed at people, with the purpose that we organize, that we unify, and that together students, workers, and peasants will change things. That was our discourse in 1970. Now that we are in the soccer season, in 1970 the World Cup was going to happen here in Mexico, and in July there were elections. In a few months before the election, 100,000 of the students, we went out on the streets to take down Luis Echeverria's campaign posters. We took down posters by the ton, and on June 13, we had a demonstration at the UNAM campus where we burned all the posters. At the Polytechnic Zacatenco, there was another demonstration where they burned Luis Echeverria's campaign posters. Well, we were saying with that we didn't believe in these elections. We didn't believe in the presidency. And of course, a year later, Luis Echeverria, at June 10th, ordered, and there was another October 2nd. Why? Because after 69 and 70, after all the things that we had done, after we went back to classes, on that June 10th, we decided it was time for us to have a demonstration at the Zócalo. We hadn't been to the Zócalo since August 27, September 13 of 68. We hadn't had a demonstration in the Zócalo. So, a few days before June 10th, we decided that it was time to go back to the Zócalo to make the country's main plaza ours again. And well, Luis Echeverria's government set a paramilitary group on us, a group that had been preparing since 68, and there was another massacre. It was so bad that there were cases where the halcones, as this paramilitary group was called, they went into the hospitals to take the wounded out and execute them. It reached that level. So that is the Mexico that came out of 68 and 71. And of course, it was no longer possible for us to do anything. Why? Because in 1969 and 70, we made ourselves very vulnerable going out far away from the schools, handing out flyers and having demonstration. We always moved in large groups. Why? Because there was persecution in 69 and 70. The government didn't want the movement to rise up again. And after June 10th, it practically became impossible.
Where did you go after you decided to leave school and to organize among the people?
In August 1970, my wife, Marcela Frias, and I, we went to work in northern Durango, in a campesino region, where there was a lot of organization. There was a honest campesino leader there, Álvaro Ríos, and he invited us to go organize there, to use our ideas of how to make base organization, which was based in the Chinese experience and the ideas of Chairman Mao Zedong. And I say it like that because in those years the Chinese experience had a lot of influence here in Mexico, and the practices and writings of Chairman Mao Zedong as a revolutionary about how to organize the people were also very influential. We went, along with a lot of other students who went to other places, we went to northern Durango. We were there for a while. After Durango, in the Campesino region, we went to a mining region in southern Chihuahua. After that mining region, we went to Durango City to work with people living in neighborhoods in very bad conditions. And for 9 years, we were in different places, working with the people, base organizations, and living like the people we were working with. That was the foundation of the Chinese experience, that whoever wants to organize the people needs to live like the people, needs to think like the people, act like the people, and be able to relate with them. And a lot of young people like Marcela Frias and I, during those 10 years that we tried to make revolution, we had that experience. We dedicated our youth from 22 to 32 years old to that experience.
What was your evaluation after those 10 years of organizing among the people? Did a new phase begin?
We achieved a lot of things. We were able to democratize labor unions. We were able to build popular urban communities, many of them in northern Durango. And it wasn't just us. There were a lot of us who were doing this kind of thing. But of course, the changes that happened later in the country, the arrival of López Portillo with the petroleum boom, and then Miguel de la Madrid, who brought neoliberalism, Carlos Salinas, and the country changing in such a way that what we had been fighting in '68, it was worse in the 90s. In terms of the abandonment of the people's needs, the sacking of the country's resources, and all of that. So it all got diluted. But of course, it wasn't like a movie. In our case, my wife and I, we had 2 children already. After about 1978, 79, we decided that we had to find a way to economically sustain our children. We started teaching, thinking that from teaching we could also continue our political work. And in fact, that was what we did.
Without changing your convictions.
I could say that for about 10 years, my passion was education. I taught high school biology and history, and my wife taught biology. And in the late 80s, in 86, 88, I started doing historical research. And since then, that's what I do. Now, I've always said that I don't have a degree in history. I got my degree in history from working with the people, organizing the people. Because the most respected historians say that to be a good historian, you have to know the people. You have to know well the subjects of history. And I think I know them very well. But also, there's something else I want to say. During the demonstration in '68, there were a lot of criticism of us for using posters of Mao Zedong, Che Guevara, Ho Chi Minh, Marx, Engels, and the press attacked us a lot, accusing us of bringing in foreign heroes, displacing our own heroes. It was a very intense criticism that we got from the press, and we took it into account. In my case, it made me think, well, what do I know about my own history? Do I know the history of Mexico, who Juárez was, who Zapata was, who Machoro Campo was, who Hidalgo was, and I came to the conclusion that I needed to know a lot more. So it was an interest that was sparked by that desire to make a change in this country. So I want to say that for the whole time that we were working with the people, we always formed study groups with the people, and we talk about history with peasants, with the poorest people, and we talk about their history, and we talk about their problems. And I got really into history, so much that it ended up being my second vocation after education, and finally I ended up as a historian, and I dedicated 3 decades of my life to that. Well, something that I can say proudly is that for 30 years I have a column in a newspaper in Chihuahua, the newspaper with the most widely circulated there. Every Sunday I write a column about some cultural or historical topic, and I share what I find most interesting about the history of Mexico. I share it with the people through those publications, and I publish several books.
And as you look back at Mexican history to inform your political activism, what figures or moments were especially important to you?
The moment that I find most interesting in the mid-19th century, it was the era where Mexican thought had the grandest vision of a free, sovereign country. I think that, well, I would argue, and I have argued in my writing, that the Constitution of 1857, after that, the reform, that was the essence of our great era in Mexican thought. And since then, Mexico hasn't had anything like that. Because of the thinkers that came out of that era, because of the ideas, because of the convictions, because of the devotion of the people who fought for the republic with Juárez. It's the best moment that this country has ever had, and I argue that we have to rescue these ideas, that Republican example.
What lessons does it have for us today in particular? It's kind of a critical moment for Mexico now.
First of all, sovereignty. We need to defend Mexico's sovereignty against the attempt to subjugate us, to use our resources and impose a foreign will on us, and to dilute our culture. I think that for the liberal reformers, the first element they took into account in those times, when the country faced 2 different foreign invasions, and there was one in 1847 and then the second in 1862. So all that republicanism represented separation of church and state, eliminating privileges, acting with honesty in the government, which was President Juárez was in Chihuahua for 2 years, Laura, for 2 years and 2 months as a president between 1864 and 66. And almost every time I talk about this, my eye comes in tears, because he was a president that lived with the people. He went out of the plazas, talked to the people, and the people sustained him. The president didn't have any other sustenance than what people gave him. The people protected him, even bought him shoes.
Very different from what we have now.
No other president in Mexico has identified so much with the people and so much love from the people as President Juárez. And I'm from there, so I can tell you that the voices that were recorded in the consciousness of the Chihuahuan people, I can still hear them.
Jesus, it's a fascinating discussion, and we could go on and on. I hope we get a chance to talk again soon. Thank you so much for being with us today. And thank